He rejected her 99 times. That sentence threaded through the campus like a rumor and like a dare, told in whispers under the bleachers and shouted as a joke at late-night parties. It sat on sticky notes, in text chains, in erased pages of notebooks. It was the thing everyone knew and no one would admit liking. For Iris Shaw, it was a ledger she had been balancing for 2 years. 99 entries, every defeat catalogued with the neatness of someone trying to impose order on hurt. The wall outside the student union told the story at a glance. 99 folded slips of paper, numbers penciled on the corner, some decorated with hearts, some smudged from rain or fingerprints. They fluttered in the wind like tiny flags of a war no one else had started. Photographs of confessions, handwritten notes, awkward vlog clips, a trembling voicemail transcribed and plastered near the top, were pinned beneath a cardboard banner that read, "One last time" in bubble letters. In the background, between the pinned confessions, a slow looped clip played on somebody's phone of Paul laughing, like he had recently discovered that laughter could be weaponized. They called it a ritual. They called it sport. They called it proof of devotion. They did all of these things with a kind of casual cruelty that suited the campus lights, where everything looked pretty from a distance and most people preferred to keep it that way. Iris had been the ritual's main event. She had learned to count to 99 in a language of small defeats. The way he would tilt his head and say "not now." The brisk, polite text he'd send at 3 a.m. from some party. The whispered, performative insult he shared with Cindy on the quad so that anyone within earshot would hear. Each rejection was different and always the same. The first few times they had stung with the fresh pain of a young woman who believed in possibility. By the 50th, it had hardened into a weird, almost mineral ache at her core. By the 90th, she had practiced detachment and failed. She had paid real costs to keep showing up. There were receipts she kept folded in the last page of a sketchbook. A check for a small house she sold in the suburbs to have the freedom to study late. The bill for the rail pass to visit campus on weekends because her internship office was only a 20-minute train ride from where Paul stayed. The invoices for fabrics and markers she bought to make presents he would, predictably, not appreciate. It felt ridiculous even as she did it, the sacrifices stacked like a private performance that only she remembered. She did them because refusing to show up felt like admitting defeat, and admitting defeat felt like letting something small and stubborn inside her die. Paul was not the kind of person who wasted attention. He was the sort you would spot in a crowd and remember. A shock of dark hair that never seemed to move, a jawline that had its own following. He'd been class president for the past 2 semesters, captain of whatever team was most camera-friendly, and the kind of charming that let him run gatherings like weather, everyone rearranged to suit him. He played the campus the way others played instruments, with a touch that made people listen. What most people forgot, what the crowd loved to forget, was that his charm had a calibrated cruelty. He had told people once, with a flippant smile during a birthday toast, that letting people confess to him was entertaining. "It's a test," he said, as if he were speaking about weather patterns. "You see who will look ridiculous to make you feel good." Cindy laughed. 2 of his friends snorted. A couple people clapped without understanding the shape of the thing they were applauding. He'd kept his rejections visible, like a trophy case. He'd rejected her in public, in private, in group chats where screenshots would be relayed with commentary. Each denial seemed to have been part of a larger design, a way to keep people watching. It granted him a kind of omniscience, the possibility of becoming the one who decided who would win, who would be humiliated, who would be rewarded. For him, the ritual was theater. For Iris, it was everything. She had been young once in a way she no longer used. Early on, she had sat across from him at a late-night campus coffeehouse napkin and poured the short version of a life story into his ears. Her mother's old sewing machine, the drawings she hid in a closet because they were not professional, the dream of applying to a design program tied to Milan through a scholarship she'd almost failed to earn. He listened and smiled and said he'd like to see her work sometime. She had handed him a sketchbook then, all elbows and breathless conviction, and he had kept the book like a totem. He had photographed the first page, sent it to friends, and then later, when she needed him to notice, he had closed the book and never opened it again. People around them understood the script. Friends would say things like, "She's got backbone," or "She's pathetic, let's be honest." each pronouncement a way of refusing to feel the full moral weight of what they were watching. Doormates curated the rumor mill. Instagram comments mapped the public humiliation. Security cameras at night sometimes caught the flutter of notes as she left them on stairs, as if each note could be a breadcrumb home. Mr. Rowe, who taught design foundations, had seen a different Iris. To him she was a student who stayed after class holding her breath like someone learning to float. He would find pieces of her work under the stack of donated models in the studio. A tacky brooch, a hand-stitched envelope, and he would press a finger to the paper and tell her she had a voice worth hearing. "Do not make the mistake of measuring your future by his attention," he told her once, in the sun-speckled quiet of his office. "Measure it by what you make when no one is looking." Mr. Rowe's words arrived like a small map she kept in her sketchbook. When she was at her lowest, after the 43rd rejection had been filmed and posted and turned into a looped GIF, she would draw a compass in the margin and write, "Go to Milan." The idea lodged like a seed. The countdown was slick with ritual. Someone had started a calendar on Instagram with the header 100 days and a picture of Iris in highlighter beneath. Friends had watched the numbers tumble closer and chosen sides. For some it had been sport, for others, curiosity. For Iris, it was a pivot point, something that would force a choice. She practiced what she would say on the 100th day until the sentences lost their edges. At first she imagined the old scene, dropped to one knee, dramatic proclamation, and the shame of repeating it seemed to sharpen like a blade. Then she tried other versions. The long letter folded into a book, a quiet text, a conversation in the rain. She crossed them out with a felt-tip pen and wrote a small phrase again and again, underlining it until ink bled through the paper. "I won't be back." The world around her reacted with a mix of boredom and expectation. The student union put up a stage for the ritual because spectacle draws a crowd. Someone in a sorority painted a banner. A barista at the late-night coffee house made a special latte called the Confession. Vendors mapped routes to the square. Phones lined up on selfie sticks like a second sun. On the night before the 100th, Iris sat on the roof of the dorm with the city below and the sky like a practiced theater curtain. She had a box beside her, old sketches, a bracelet she had bought and never given him, and a small printed flyer for the Milan-linked design contest that had arrived earlier that week with a bold, ridiculous resume of possibility. The flyer was glossy and improbable and reminded her that other doors could be opened. She was not sure when she stopped wanting him in the way of a plea and began wanting him as a small, sorrowed fact she could explain to a new self. The difference was subtle and enormous. It was the difference between needing permission and being free from needing it. The day of the 100th, the banquet, the square, the bells, the phones, arrived like a holiday. People clustered, folding the air tight with the electricity of expectation. Cindy stood at Paul's elbow in a dress that managed to be both ironic and precise. Paul entertained the crowd with half-jokes and practiced sympathies. He wore the same look that had made him popular, the sort of half-smile that could soften an accusation or harden a joke. Iris walked through the throng without anyone making way. She wore a simple suit jacket borrowed from a thrift store, a bright dress underneath that suggested color without theater. Someone had put up a large fold of paper for confessions on a wire. People had written entire mini-speeches on sticky notes and pasted them. Others had scrawled short, clever insults. Her own note, folded small and tucked into the seam of her pocket, was unremarkable. It read, "For the last time, I'm choosing myself." She had decided to do something no one expected. She would accept an invitation that had nothing to do with Paul. Lan had been in the program for only a semester, a quiet presence who had a way of listening that didn't make people feel like they were answers to be corrected. He was from a coastal town where storms were a kind of punctuation for life. Lan had seen her work once, in a studio corner where she left an extra model because she couldn't carry it home, and he had asked questions that were actually about the work, about shape and weight, and the way light made fabric confess its lines. He had shown up at group critiques and asked for a closer look when others offered platitudes. He carried tools in a canvas bag and had hands that smelled faintly of oil and sea. Their friendship began in the slow way of things that are not declared. He invited her to a small after-hours workshop, a team project for the Milan contest, and she had gone because the offer was about her craft, not her face. The invitation was practical, the type that arrived in the form of a text. "We need someone who knows pattern. Come by Studio B after class?" She accepted because Mr. Rowe had nudged her, and because the idea of working with people who judged her on work, not on showmanship, had an appeal she hadn't realized she wanted. Lan's invitation was different from Paul's because it was an entrance, not a test. It was a sentence that led to other sentences, a team, a plan, a proposal. It contained the names of other young makers, a list of materials, a proposal deadline, and a bus fare reimbursement. Lan said nothing flirtatious. He was simply exact. "Iris," he said once, folding a strip of fabric, "we could use your touch." To accept what Lan offered felt like a manifesto, to choose a life that required presence and production rather than performance. It was a small, practical headline. It would, at a blow, reframe the ritual everyone assumed she existed within. The 99 motifs had been woven into campus conversations so thoroughly that when she told Mr. Rowe she would decline the ritual, he did not look surprised. "Not everyone gets to choose their exit," he said, and then he smiled the way people smile at children who have decided to become fierce. "But you, if anyone, should pick a good one." She planned her exit precisely. The announcement would not be a confession to be rejected, but a declaration she made into a microphone. She would go to the square and say goodbye. She would say the words that had been rehearsed until they no longer felt like bravery, but like truth. "I don't like you anymore. I won't be back. Goodbye." She also planned the other action. A small on-stage acceptance of Lan's public invitation to join the Milan project. Lan, with a dry stoicism, had printed little cards that read, "Join us Team Milan," and handed them to a handful of students who might be useful. The cards, when waved, were an act, a public making of alliances. He gave her one privately and said simply, "Say yes. Do it in front of them." Doing it in public mattered. It would pierce the ritual like a needle. Accepting a man's invitation in front of the crowd, any man apparently, had been the curriculum of Paul's arrogance, that a different man would offer, and that she would accept, not with a slink back into dependence but with a smile and a handshake, would be the inversion of all the accumulated nights of watching her kneel and be told no. It would be an act of taking agency in the most visible way. When she told a few close friends, the reactions scattered across the spectrum. Mara, her roommate, clapped and hugged her. "Finally," Mara said with the kind of tenderness that collected like warm coins. Jonah, a quiet doormate who had watched far too many of the confessions from the stairwell, shook his head and said, "You'll make him mad." He said it like a warning, and like a fact he had already given too much thought to. The student union crowd gathered in the square like a shore. People with cameras, people with cheap signs, people who had nothing better to do, all of them folding their presence into the ritual. The stage was modest, risers and a microphone, a banner that read, "Confessions one last time," stretching behind it, and speakers that threw everyone's voices into a friendly echo. Someone had rigged lights to dazzle, to create that false intimacy that makes public life feel cinematic. Paul watched from the edge as if from the glass of a terrarium, contained, curious, confident. He had friends with him who looked as if they had rehearsed laughter. Cindy stood close, a steady presence who seemed to consider herself the steward of narrative. She had for years occupied the role he needed, the friend who would keep his secrets and occasionally let them out like sparklers. Paul's smile then was small and dangerous, the kind that could make a person misinterpret cruelty as cleverness. Iris climbed the small riser and held the microphone. The crowd first laughed, expecting ritual. She showed them how wrong they had been. "Hi," she said. It was not an apology. It was not performance. It was a greeting that refused to be coy. She spoke of things she had not spoken aloud before. She spoke about the studio, about the long evenings spent making things that didn't fit into anyone's neat expectations. She spoke about selling the house she had once thought would tether her to a life of compromise, and how that sale gave her a weird kind of freedom. She spoke about Mr. Rowe's voice telling her to measure her future by her work, not by attention. She spoke about being tired. She did not enumerate the 99 rejections. She did not plead. She did not beg. She said simply, "Today is not about asking you to change your mind or to give me a yes. Today is about saying goodbye." A flip of silence, cloth soft on a spring night. Phones rose like a field of metallic flowers. She held Lan's card at arm's length until everyone saw it. The Join Us printing caught the spotlight. "Lan, she said into the microphone, and the name felt like a bell. Lan invited me to work with Team Milan. He asked me to join their project. I said yes. A slice through the ritual. Murmurs rose like a small tide. In the crowd, reactions arrived in a chorus. Some laughed, some huffed, some, eyes hard in the light, shifted their allegiance like people moving at a table to hear better. Cindy's face rearranged into a studied blank. Paul's smile faltered in the specific way a light can trip when a bulb blows. The words landed where they were meant to land. This was not pleading. It was not a trap. It was an invitation accepted. It was an exit. Paul's hand tightened on the edge of the stage. His jaw worked as though chewing away the incredulity. He stepped forward before anyone could claim him the moment. His voice came out in a pitch he clearly meant to control, the sort of voice that would be replayed later in whisper and then in anger. "Is this a joke?" he called. The sarcasm in it was like a file. Iris looked at him and said, with an evenness that had been refined by practice and nourishment and grief, "No, it's not a joke." Lan moved from the wings with a steady gait, nothing theatrical about him. He stepped up beside Iris with the card in hand, and for the first time, the crowd seemed to notice that not every arrangement required an audience's applause. He offered his hand with an invitation that was not a test. Paul's laugh was short and brittle. "You're going to run away with them? Go to Milan with these people?" he said, as if geography itself were a betrayal. Lan's face did not harden or soften. It simply was a boundary. "We'd like her on the team," he said. "Her work speaks." There was no edge of ownership in his words, only the clean statement of collaboration. Cindy leaned in, voice a silk tongue of mockery. "So the great Iris chooses someone else's invitation over our beloved Paul," she said with a smirk that had been sharpened over months of rehearsed cruelty. The crowd tasted a new kind of entertainment. Phones moved to capture every tilt of expression. For 2 years, they had photographed the way Iris bowed. Now they could photograph the way she stood. Iris accepted Lan's hand publicly. The handshake was brief and formal and meant to signal more than a gesture. It was a contract with possibility. The image of it would later be screenshotted and monetized. For now, it felt like a small warm clasp that closed one story and opened another. There was a lurch in Paul, like a person who had expected gravity to remain reliable and found it temporarily unreliable. "You can't just," he began. "You cannot keep me as a pastime," Iris said, and the words were not cruel. They were precise. Jonah, who had been a quiet observer, felt something old and bone-sore break. He looked at Paul the way a referee looks at a player who has broken a field's rules. "Dude," Jonah said loudly, so that the joke evaporated into audible fact. "That's not a game." Paul's face tightened into a look that might have once been called rage. For a flash, it was the raw animal of someone unused to being refused, and then it simmered into a kind of manic incredulity. He stepped closer until he was inches from Iris, and the crowd instinctively leaned away, folding a private space between them. "You think you can walk away from this by taking a hand from someone else?" he demanded. His voice had the condensation of something that had been cold for too long and suddenly thawed. Iris didn't step back. She squared her shoulders, felt Lan's hand still at hers like a brace. It was a tiny human thing, support, and for a moment she remembered Jaden, a childhood classmate who had told her once that bravery was often small and practical. She said softly, "I'm not walking away from you. I am walking towards something that isn't built on your amusement." A ripple of stunned curiosity passed through the crowd. Some people had never seen anyone speak to Paul without laughing or blinking. His face registered humiliation the way a mirror registers cracks, sudden, multifaceted, and impossible to ignore. Cindy laughed, too loud, her voice scraping. "You always did have the drama," she mocked. The joke held until Paul's laughter went too sharp. The edge of his mouth twitched, and he shoved his way through the small space, his push more performative than forceful, but it had the effect of making the crowd inhale. Security, a polite presence by the food trucks, swapped glances and edged forward as they do when a system is about to be asked to choose a side. "You're making me look ridiculous," Paul hissed, and the words had a deeper tiredness than insult. In them was nakedness, the realization that his play had failed to produce the effect he cherished. For months his power had been predictable. The script had told him how to land applause. Now the script had been flipped in front of him. Iris felt a sudden heat, fear, not of Paul as a physical threat, but of what his being unmoored might mean. She had seen men angry before. She had seen the texture of anger that was performative and the texture that was about real hurt. This was a thing somewhere between. It was dangerous because it was unfamiliar to him. He had never been refused in this particular public and precise way. Lan tightened his grip on Iris's hand the way a compass stays true when knocked. He moved between Paul and Iris with a quiet decisiveness, not as a guard, but as an assertion. "We will not let you make this a spectacle." "You need to leave," Lan said low. His voice had the clarity of someone filing a clear plan into place. It was not a command so much as a directive, a place where reasonable action could sit. "You need to step away." For a moment, the crowd waited for Paul to perform the kind of magnanimous exit that men like him mastered. He could have laughed, taken the long route away with a tossing of hair, staged a final joke, and then let the night be a footnote. He did not. Instead, something inside him flared with a brazen, unstructured energy. He grabbed the microphone stand with both hands as if to anchor himself and leaned into it. "You think this is about me?" he shouted. His voice ricocheted like a stone flung into the square. "You think I enjoy being mocked?" The sentence was raw, and for a second those words had something like truth. But the weapon he used was not truth. It was expectation weaponized into anger. The crowd recoiled because it was the sound of a man discovering an edge of himself he had not disclosed, and sound like that is dangerous in a public place. Mr. Rowe stepped forward then, as a teacher does when the classroom leaks into life. He did not push or shout. He placed a single hand on Paul's shoulder and met his eyes. "Paul," he said quietly, the kind of voice that had the power to carry weight without adding fat to it, "you need to step back." Paul's jaw worked. For a second more he stared, and then he seemed to choose a path that would either demonstrate contrition or unravel. He pulled away like a man deciding whether to hold a coiled rope. As he stepped back, his expression folded into the shape of someone sobering up too quickly. There was fear in it, not only for himself, but as if the crowd had finally shown him a shape his reflection could not bear. He walked away not with the swagger he'd used, but with a kind of irritated, petulant stride. Phones recorded his retreat. Cindy followed, whispering something meant to be unreadable to others. The square exhaled, and small groups rearranged into conversations. Who had been right? Who would be next? The sticky notes trembled in a soft wind like a chorus of small resignations. Iris stayed where she was for a long moment, the microphone cool in her grip. People called out variations of congratulations and snide commentary, and through it all her chest held the odd steadiness of one who had chosen course. Lan's fingers were an anchor at hers. She felt the tightness of adrenaline ebb into a clearer current, like a river that had found its bed. Jonah walked up the riser and clapped once, loud and precise, as if to mark time. "That's for staying human," he said to Iris, and the words landed like a small necessary truth. The police cars that had been, until now, distant figures on the periphery were now starting to appear near the entrances to the square, not in response to violence as it turned out, but because when large crowds gather in collegiate centers, the municipality deems it prudent. Their presence gave the evening a layer of formal consequence that made people suddenly aware that actions now could be recorded into officialdom as well as memory. As she stepped down from the stage, the sticky notes on the board fluttered as if in a whisper. 99 remained, silent and accusing. But the 100th had been written in a different ink. The square, which had been waiting for another of her kneelings, had instead watched a woman take a card and a hand and say yes to a future that had nothing to do with a man's approval. She had accepted another man's invitation, publicly, politely, and irrevocably. For Paul, retreat was not answer enough. In the days that followed, rumor would render his next actions with the violet sheen of myth. That he had disappeared into a rocker's frenzy. That he had been seen at the bus stop buying an all-night ticket. That he had cussed out the student paper. The reality was messier and quieter. He paced the edges of his usual haunts like a person checking the seams of their safety net. He met friends in small rooms and told the same story with increasing agitation. He texted ex-lovers and old acquaintances like someone practicing confession, and he stood too long at the window of the coffee house where Iris had first given him a sketchbook. But immediately and directly after he left the square that night, there was a visible change. He no longer played the part of the man who could command attention and chuck it away. He played instead at being the man who could not believe he had lost a stage. That disbelief, as it tends to do, found its expression in fury that was not theatrical, but rather lived and raw. Iris returned to the studio with Lon later that week and found the workshop smell. Sawdust, fresh glue, the perfume of possibilities, like medicine. People lined the benches with their tools and their half-formed dreams. Lon had arranged a small circle of materials and a place for her to work. He had, without flourish, prepared a seat and a soldering iron and a quiet pile of fabrics. He had printed another card and placed it on her workstation. Welcome, Team Milan. She accepted the card with both hands. The acceptance was not a love story. It was an acceptance of craft. It was perhaps a rarer thing, certainly less theatrical. When she slid into work, measuring, cutting, pinning, the space folded gently around her like a new garment. People asked practical questions. They pointed at patterns. They argued about seam allowances and about the way color could read across a stage. For the first time in a long while, her conversations were about things that would help her leave, not about things that would keep her staying. People still noticed Paul. He moved through campus with the rigid alertness of someone who has been set loose without a map. There were nights when he would show up at the same small gallery where some students gathered and watched from the back as if trying to memorize the faces of those who had left him out of their stories. He visited a few mutual friends and asked for sympathy. At one point, in a terse message to Jonah, he wrote, "She humiliated me on purpose." Jonah, who had never been one to flatten people's feelings, replied, "She offered herself a life. That's not humiliation, that's courage." It should be said, with clarity, that the campus people who had once laughed at Iris now had to contend with an uncomfortable image, one where their entertainment had fed a kind of moral injury. Some of them felt bad, others deflected by producing a fresh scandal. Humans are skilled at refuge through distraction. Iris's days began to thicken with the ordinary labor of preparing for something real. She visited Mr. Rowe with new sketches, and he nodded in ways that were almost proud. "This will do," he said. "Refuse to sell your touch short." She spent nights studying technical details that had previously bored her, but now felt like footholds. She built a portfolio and sent the application to the Milan program with a kind of quiet ceremonial determination. It felt like a letter to a future self that she was finally brave enough to meet. Yet the 99 did not vanish by her choosing. They remained, a constellation she had to navigate. Sometimes she would catch an expression on someone's face and be sure they had replayed the square in slow motion, choosing the cruelest frames. Sometimes she dreamed that the sticky notes multiplied and became a physical wall she had to climb over. The past, as past tends to be, was a force more stubborn than she had imagined. This new life with Lan at her side made those ghosts less sharp. He moved with a steady, deliberate care and no fanfare. He did not offer platitudes. He offered tools and schedules and the kind of silence that lets someone think in peace. His presence was not a cure for grief, but it was a place to rest. The weeks that followed brought small public tests. Paul would appear at a lecture with the intention of being casual, and the room would crack like a fragile jar under pressure. He would post a cryptic line on social media, one that people read and reread for hidden meanings. Once, he showed up at Studio B in a way that felt like an ambush. He stepped into the doorway when everyone was working and said, loud enough for the people hunched over their benches to hear, "I didn't think she had it in her." It was not a compliment. It was a wound. The team around Iris did not retaliate with spectacle. They went back to work. Lon raised his eyes once, and in that glance there was a message: do the work. That insistence on process became its own quiet armor. If the thing Paul wanted was a show, the answer, continuous and composed, was to show up and be industrious. It was, perhaps, the most annoying sort of revenge, to remain ordinary and thereby outlast theatrics. On a raw afternoon when the wind shivered through the studio doors, Paul did something that would complicate everything. He sent a message to the campus events email claiming an infringement, an accusation about the legality of the station they had used for the confession event. an attempt to taint the public memory as improper and staged. The administration, careful and legal-minded, began an inquiry that came with the slow, bureaucratic hum of caution. It was the kind of thing that looked on paper like concern for order, and not in truth like the act of someone trying to pull a curtain. It was a small procedural sabotage. They called meetings, people asked for statements. Mr. Rowe wrote a defense like he was attesting to students he trusted, work portfolios, attendance logs, character references. As mundane as it seemed, the inquiry had the effect of turning a cultural moment into an institutional one. It was debilitating in a new way. It put the ritual under a microscope and forced Iris to navigate the administrative machinery that had nothing to do with creative labor. Everything becomes heavier when it must be explained under lights. At night, when the studio cleared and the lights dimmed, you could still find signs of ordinary courage. On a table lay a stack of Lindt chocolate bars someone had left, a small, hopeful offering. Near the door, someone had taped up a new sticky note with a single sentence in neat handwriting. 100 is a beginning, not an end. It was a slogan and a prayer all at once. Then, one evening, as rain began to drum against the studio windows and the university hummed with the tiredness of finals week, Iris received a text that asked for something small but public. Lan texted, "Are you free tomorrow? There's a press meet outside the student union about the Milan teams. They want a representative. Will you come and stand with me?" She read the message twice. The invitation was plain, not theatrical. It was, in fact, exactly what she wanted, a chance to be seen for work and for team, not sacrifice. She typed back, "Yes." She added nothing else. Accepting Lan's invitation had consequences that neither of them could have fully anticipated. It set them in motion toward the center of the campus once more, where ritual and rumor sat like brambles. This acceptance would be concrete: attendance, handshake, a photograph for a small campus paper. In a week, it would be a headline: Iris Shaw joins Team Milan. For now, it was a choice made quietly in the shared fatigue of two people who had decided to do the work. On the way out that night, under a canopy of wet light, she pocketed the small card with "Join Us" printed in faint ink and felt, for the first time in a long time, that 100 could be the pivot point towards something that belonged to her rather than to him. She imagined boards in Milan, small teams poring over patterns, the quiet hours of judged critique. She imagined being measured by the exactness of her craft, and not by whether her face could start a laugh. At the edge of the campus, where the lamplight pooled like molten gold, a shadow lengthened toward her. It was Paul, pacing as if expecting the bridge between them to reset. He stepped into the light, wordless for a moment, as if searching for the sentence that would wrap everything back into his shape. "You accepted him?" he asked, not really a question. "Yes," she said. The word dropped clean and unornamented into the night. He laughed then, a small sound that held too much and not enough. "You didn't have to," he said, as if it were a favor she had denied him. "You could have stayed in the show." "I didn't want to," she said. "I wanted to work." His face changed then, in a way that looked like the beginning of an unraveling. He looked around, as if expecting someone to jump up and say that this had all been a joke he could end at will. The sidewalk seemed to constrict under his confusion. "You'll come back," he said, more a demand than a hope. She looked at him as if at a person asking for a thing he had no right to ask. "No," she said, and the finality of it felt like a hinge closing. He held her gaze for a beat longer, as if to memorize the new angles of her face, the firmness of her mouth. Then he turned away and walked fast, the kind of brisk step that disguises wobble. She watched him go without reaching for him. It would be, she decided, a problem he could not script his way out of. Days folded into a pattern of small ricocheting strangeness after that night. Paul's routines frayed in ways that were visible, more pacing, fewer plans. A curious urgency to be seen in the places he once owned by sheer habit. He began to haunt edges: the coffee house where he'd first smiled at her sketchbook, the student gallery openings, the table where the doormates played cards. He had always been good at being seen. He was suddenly very bad at being invisible. Rumors did their work. People who had been casual witnesses to his confidence now traded news stories of him making late-night calls, of him posting a picture of a closed door with the caption "Doors Close," of a private message to Cindy that had been forwarded and then deleted. A few who had once laughed at Iris's expense tried to soothe the remainder of their conscience with awkward compliments in the hallways. Paul took them like an injured animal might take pats meant for someone else, with suspicion. Iris's life tightened at the seams with the practical work of leaving. The Milan application moved forward on a dozen small, steady decisions: portfolio revisions, a visa appointment, the planning of the show they were to present as Team Milan. She learned how to write a polite refusal, and when politeness was a mask for neglect, she discovered the satisfying architecture of a schedule, how timetables could be both armor and map. Lan's presence in the workshop was a slow, steady rhythm. He kept to times and lists, and in the repetition of tools and measurements, she began to feel like a person whose edges would hold. Then, in the odd arithmetic of campus life, the past curdled into the new in a way that could not be predicted. The press meet Lan had mentioned, the one where the Milan teams would be introduced to the student paper and a local photographer, was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in the open plaza outside the student union. They asked for a representative from each team to stand with the organizer and answer a few short questions. For Iris, it was public and tame. A small photograph, a name listed beneath a headline about talent and opportunity. On the plaza that day, the light had a thin gray honesty to it. Lan arrived early and wore a jacket that smelled faintly of sea wind. He moved like someone who was careful about being late and careless about being noticed. Iris stood with other students, each clutching a small printed sheet with their talking points. Cameras focused on the lineup. Someone from the paper joked about the confession days, but then caught himself as others around him remembered that what had happened was not a joke at all. Paul was not supposed to be there. No one expected him to appear again. That was the whole point of leaving. He arrived as the first cluster of photos were taken, breathing as if he'd run a stretch. When he stepped into the frame of a camera lens, people flicked their attention reflexively toward him. For a moment, everything narrowed to the shape of his figure, the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. He approached with the kind of smile that had a practiced softness. "Iris," he said loud enough for the photographer to catch it in the mix of shutter clicks. "What is this? Team Milan? Since when?" Lan's expression did not shift into proprietorship. He simply answered as a person would when asked about work. "Since we invited her," he said. "Since she accepted." Paul's jaw tightened the way something mechanical does before it catches. He looked at Iris and then at the press people assembling their shots, and in his face was that same odd mixture of disbelief and hurt that had been simmering for weeks. "You're making me the joke," he said. It was not a question. The sentence landed like a pebble thrown into a tidy pond. Ripples traveled outward in the form of side glances and an extra frame on a photograph. "Then don't make the joke," Iris replied. She kept her voice measured, the cadence she had practiced when she wanted to be clear rather than perform. A reporter scribbled. The photographer angled his lens. For a sliver of time it could have been anything. A line to be walked with composure and a minor scene that would simmer and die. But the crowd that had once treated everything about Iris as potential entertainment had an appetite for spectacle, and spectacle, like hunger, could be coaxed. Paul stepped closer. People around the plaza shuffled, sensing conflict the way a room senses rain. Jonah, who had taken to watching the edges like a worried uncle, moved to stand nearer, his posture an unspoken cautery against escalation. Cindy hovered, a poised neutral with a history of supplying the laugh track. Mr. Rowe stayed back a respectful distance, but watched with a teacher's worry etched on his face. "You think you can just—" Paul began, and the sentence was more about possession than punctuation. "I don't think anything about you," Iris said, and it was the precise cut Paul could not swallow. She said it without cruelty. She said it with the exhausted clarity of someone who had run out of currency for what he wanted to buy. "I'm representing a team. I'm doing the work." "You're humiliating me," he spat, and the language went flatly theatrical. The syllables had been rehearsed for a moment like this. He had found a sentence that matched his feeling and meant to pin it like a badge. "No," Lan interrupted, low and firm. Lan did not shout. There was a steadiness in him that did not need volume to convey boundary. You're making yourself the thing you say others made you. It was the sort of tiny escalation that could be resolved with a steadying breath. Instead, Paul grabbed a paper handout from a nearby table and crumpled it into his fist, as if the paperwork had been an accusation. He shoved it toward Lon in a gesture that read like an offering or a weapon. Lon put his hands out to take control of the movement, and the paper slipped between them like a small tattered flag. The shove jolted the crowd. Someone screamed, not loud, just a sharp note, and people began to close in as if drawn by a magnetized moment. Security moved faster than they had at the square. Years of campus policy create muscle memory for this kind of scene. A student volunteer stepped between them, hands raised in the universal gesture of stop. Paul looked around as if for an audience that would restore his shape. Eyes scanned the faces. Some were curious, some were horrified. Phones lifted. Then Paul laughed in a way that was thin and breaking. It was too high, too fast. Not a laugh that sits with charm, but one that strips it away. You all think this is so noble, he said. You think you can turn me into the bad guy and go be angels. You already were doing that, Jonah said sharply. It's called being decent. Paul's hand swung at nothing and everything. He shoved toward Jonah as if to cross the impossible distance between theater and life. In the shove, there was a moment of contact, an accidental but undeniable brush. Jonah, not wanting to escalate, shoved back with more force than the confrontation deserved. For a beat, they were in a human tangle, too close, too hot, too witnessed, and then Lan moved like a hinge and put himself physically between Paul and the others. What are you doing? Paul demanded, his breath heavy now. He was not merely angry, he seemed to be searching for the shape of himself in the frenzy. Lan's voice was low. You need to step away, he said again, firm and not belligerent. We'll talk when you can. Paul's face began to shift from the sharp edges of anger to something softer and more dangerous. Panic. His hands trembled around the microphone stand someone had left close by. He gripped it as if it were a railing and leaned on the metal like a person who had lost sight of the shore. Then, without warning, his knees folded. The cameras caught the first ripple of movement, and the plaza that had been poised for spectacle suddenly broke into motion like a flock startled by a hawk. Paul's body slumped, then crumpled. One moment he was the center of a small controversy. The next he was a shape on the concrete. Lan reached for him reflexively, instinct overriding caution. There was a sound, a collective breath sucked in. Then someone called for help. They called it a collapse later, as if language could tame the oddness of the moment. Up close, it was more immediate and less narratable. Paul's face paled, his hands slackened, and the kind of noise people make when they try to find words dissolved into hurried steps. Security and volunteers circled, cell phones converted to emergency lines. Someone put a jacket under his head. Someone else kept the camera angled away, the ethical reflex of a bystander doing the small thing that might be right. At the hospital, the lights were sterile and patient, and the air smelled like disinfectant and coffee. Paramedics and nurses moved with practiced economy. They asked questions in short, efficient phrases. Nobody shouted, nobody celebrated. The collapse had taken the shape of consequence, not revenge. Iris rode in a car with Lan and Jonah, the three of them a quiet triangle of movement. Lan's grip on the steering wheel was a taut line. Iris felt a strange double vision, acute concern for the human in front of her, alongside a steady awareness that this was the point at which her life was none of his to control. That line, between compassion and self-preservation, felt like the tightest place she had to stand. In the emergency room, a doctor spoke in measured tones to a cluster of people who had known Paul in different ways. There was talk of fainting spells, of dehydration, of stress-induced episodes. The language was clinical but not cold, a professional refusal to be narrative. They ran tests, they asked about medication, about family history. Someone called his mother. Paul's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but regular. When he finally opened his eyes, it was to the strange, flattened light of recovery. There was a bruise of shadow under them, and the kind of fatigue that wears someone thin in two different directions, physically and existentially. He looked around for the shape of an audience and found only a handful of faces. A nurse, a doctor, Mr. Rowe, who sat in a chair with an expression that read like a question and an apology, and then Iris. His mouth moved like someone trying to remember how to speak a simple language. I thought I could control it, he said, voice small and wet. It was not an excuse so much as a revelation, the naked admission that the stage had been his safety, and without it the scenery frightened him. Iris sat near, but not too near. There was a space she refused to let him fill, a border not of cruelty but of self-respect. "You tried to control people," she said quietly. "You made a game out of attention." "Attention is the same as love," he said, and for once the phrase was not coded in the brittle sarcasm he usually used. It sounded like someone discovering a belief and not knowing whether to defend it. "When they cheered, when they watched, I could be enough." "You were never enough to yourself," Mr. Rowe said, steadier than anyone else in the room. "That's different." Paul's hand reached out, not measured, as if to find something to hold. Iris watched it hover and then fall back to his side. The motion was human and messy. "I thought that if they kept wanting me, I would keep feeling finished," he said. The sentence came out like a child's confession. "I made it into a show, so I wouldn't have to ask for anything real." There was a long, thin pause. Outside the window, a sky slid its slow, indifferent light across the hospital facade. "I'm sorry," Paul added, and the word had no flourish. Apology was thin in the room. It had been overused and underfelt by the people who had been his audience. This version of sorry felt raw and without performance. Iris felt a small empathy, the kind that sits near the ribs and does not require grand gestures. She had been made small in her attempts to be seen. She had also watched humiliation do quiet work on a person's interior. She knew that confession in a hospital bed had a particular currency. It could be real, or it could be the last stage trick. She had learned to listen to the small things that made words true, sustained acts, a person's willingness to be boring and consistent rather than theatrical. "So what now?" she asked, not mean but clearly pointed. The question was a hinge. Paul's eyes filled and emptied with something like regret. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know how to be ordinary." "You can learn," she said, "if you want to." He turned his face toward her, as if the idea of learning were a new door. "Will you?" The question stalled. He did not ask her to stay. He could not. The impulse instead was a smaller, cruder thing, to be seen by the person who had been his most persistent witness. Iris's answer was both softer and firmer than he might have needed. "I can't be the person who holds your mirror anymore," she said. "I've started building something that isn't about you. I'm going to Milan. I'm going to work. I'll be sad for you. I can be that. I can be compassionate, but I won't let myself be the stage." Lan stood up then, the motion quiet and precise. He did not say much. Lan rarely did when words would only make a show out of a tender thing, but he placed a hand on Paul's shoulder, an act that felt like both an offer and a boundary. "Take care of yourself," Lan said. "Get help." There were no cinematic reconciliations. There were no dramatic embraces where everything healed in a neat 2-minute montage. Instead, there were practical orders, telephone numbers written on a hospital pad, an agreement to see a counselor, a promise from Paul to take his medication, and an appointment with a general practitioner to follow up. It was, in truth, the kind of prosaic care that repairs lives in slow increments rather than in singular, operatic confessions. As they left the hospital, Iris felt the evening compress the day into a thinner shape. She and Lan walked a few blocks in silence before a taxi took them toward the studio. The air tasted like a coming winter. Jonah sent a text, "Are you okay?" And she replied with a small, honest sentence, "I'm okay. I'm going." The days before the departure were a quiet, unshowy flurry. There was packing and there was paperwork, and there was a small going-away party organized by people who had been quietly building her life around tools and schedules. Mr. Rowe came and gave a small speech about not measuring yourself by someone else's attention. Mara braided her hair the way friends do when they do not know what else to give. Lan lent practical help, extra tape, a borrowed ruler, coffee runs that left a faint ring of gratitude on her palm. On her last morning, Iris walked to the plane in the particular hush that comes when a place you know becomes a memory in a suitcase. The campus looked smaller from a bus window. The sticky notes on the board outside the Union seemed to shimmer with the odd translucence of things that had been both public and private. 99 remained. Each slip of paper was still there, fluttering like ghosts. The 100th, however, had its own newness, a photograph in a student paper. a headline that read, "Iris Shaw joins Team Milan," and a small write-up that spoke about craft and courage. Paul's story did not end with an ambulance or with her boarding pass. He did not fade into melodrama. Instead, he had to live with the consequences of having weaponized people's attention for his own safety net. He was required to answer questions he had never asked himself: how to be quiet, how to be ordinary, how to be small without being erased. In the months to come, there were apologies that were made and apologies that never quite reached another person. People spoke in the coffee house about how they had once laughed too easily. A few wrote essays that read like remorse. Some of the sticky notes were eventually taken down by hands that wanted to move on. Others remained, stubborn as barnacles. On the tarmac, Iris looked at Lon, and he smiled that small, steady smile of someone who measured his life in parts that could be counted: tools, time, careful choices. He hadn't come to the airport with a speech. He had come with a notebook full of logistical advice and a card that read, "Join us in the corner," a rare piece of stationery that had followed her onto planes and into studios. She took his hand for a second, not a dramatic gesture, but a human one, a clasp that said, "We started a project together, and maybe, if the world allowed, we would keep doing that work." "You okay?" Lon asked, practical and soft. She was. It was not a perfect happiness. It was the complicated grace of someone who had carried hurt and then had learned how to tie it into the back of a suitcase and say, "I'm going." "I'm choosing this," she said. The words were light and true. From the departure gate, she watched the city recede. Below, the campus dissolved into squares and roofs and the sticky note board that had once seemed like a ledger of pain. In her bag lay a sketchbook with a new compass drawn in the margin. She opened it and wrote 3 words on the first clean page, neat and final: "I won't be back." Paul's loss was not a final death of character, but a sudden staggering seeing of consequence. He had, in the end, lost the thing he had built his identity around: a captive audience. The loss cost him a collapse in a hospital bed and the long labor of reworking himself without applause. It would take time to learn that attention and love were not interchangeable, that humiliation had gravity, and that dignity often grows in the small, unbroadcast acts of doing. People would tell the story in new ways. Some would make it a fable about pride, others about redemption. The truth would remain messy. A man who had made cruelty his stage, and a woman who refused to be his prop. On the plane, Iris sketched without needing to hide her hands. Her lines were steadier than they had been 2 years earlier. The horizon was a thin slice of gray, and she thought of Mr. Rowe's words, of the little compass in the margin of her sketchbook, of the sticky notes that had once pinned her to a ritual. She thought of the number 100, and how for her, it had become not an ending but a seam. At the end of all the rumor and the spectacle and the hospital rooms, the story came down to a quiet fact. She had been rejected 99 times. On the 100th, she accepted another man's invitation, not as a prize or revenge, but as a practical public yes to the work she wanted to do. When she did, Paul lost the performance he had relied on. He lost it physically and emotionally. He lost the certainty that his life could be written by the inveterate rhythm of an audience. Her leaving was not a triumph over him so much as a move toward herself. The plane rose and the city fell away, and in the narrow window she could see, if she wanted to, the tiny square of the student union and the sticky notes that would, in time, be carried away by wind. She closed her sketchbook, felt Lon's hand let go with the soft pressure of farewell, and allowed herself to imagine a boardroom in Milan, a gaunt chart of tasks, a tiny light over a work table, things that would measure her by what she made, not by who watched. Somewhere below, on a campus that now understood an old cruelty in a new light, a man would learn, in the tedious language of healing, how much he had cost himself. And a woman who had been rejected 99 times would, on the 100th, say yes to something that belonged to her, and in doing so, change the script for both of them.